Helen, I think we should just start because otherwise I'm going to ask you all these questions and then it won't be an episode. So, welcome to the Business Karaoke podcast. I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to seeing where this communication is going to go to because there's so many things we could talk about.
I know. So we're trying to maximize the time. I really want to begin with you position yourself as a coach for women. Why did you
hmm
choose women?
So the focus on women has come in more recent years. I started off
Mhm.
my career after, so let's say after the corporate world. I was in the corporate world for almost 3 decades and 10 years of that with McKinsey, where I was a coach and a trainer, focusing primarily on communication skills and especially for leaders.
Mhm.
When I left McKinsey in 2013, I set up my own business. My focus was still communication. And I absolutely loved that because, things like presentation skills, you see someone come into the room, they're all nervous. And then after just spending a little bit of time together, they get a little bit of some mindset shifts and
Mhm.
some skills, and they walk out of the room a different person with a
Mhm.
whole new level of confidence. So I was focusing on that for a number of years, and it was actually one of my online program participants, and she said, "Helen, what about doing more broad coaching because you've got so
Mhm.
much experience, so much expertise?" And so
Mhm.
that's how I actually got into creating a women's program,
Mhm.
and then towards the end of 2019, I was presenting at a
Mhm.
mastermind that I was part of about my results for the year. And I was
Mhm.
talking about this is the communication side of things, da 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 da.
Mhm.
And then this is the women's success side of things. And everybody
Two
was like,
different people.
yeah, they're like, wow, Helen, can you see the difference in how
Yeah.
you talk about these? And I hadn't even thought about it. And
Mhm.
that's when I realized that I had so much passion for the women's success side of things. So then from the beginning, it's only quite recently, only from the
Mm.
beginning of 2020, that I made that conscious decision that the women's success is coming first. I still do communication skills coaching. Um, I work with big corporations.
Mm.
I coach male executives,
Mm.
but my passion lies with supporting the women.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think this is quite, even a timely conversation if we think about the position you a few years back at TEDx Roppongi held you spoke about why Japan or how, Japanese people or Japanese women can ask questions and share and how to kind of get that women's voices, that energy of women in the boardroom without it kind of being as you mentioned, that mottainai culture, like that without, it being used. And we're kind of speaking at a time where we've just come off last week and the week before quite what the press love in terms of having, someone have a pie in their face because they said the wrong thing. So we've just come off Mori-san essentially saying that whether he was paraphrased or not is up for discussion. But we've kind of just almost given space for maybe the elephant in the room in Japan, which is that we still are dealing with many maybe even stigmas when it comes to women in leadership positions. I'd love to hear a little bit of your view on that. And the other thing, and I also want to kind of polarize this with the people in my career, especially in Japan, that I've received the most support from have been men. So it's this kind of strange dichotomy, almost this parallel universe, where on one side of the table you have men that are saying, well, women talk too much, that's why meetings go on for so long. And then the other side, we have the we have the other side of the table, which is kind of Japanese men who have honestly gone, and I'm talking about my clients, I'm talking about friends that have gone above and beyond anything that they require or that's asked of them to support me being a woman. So tell me a little bit about your experience, obviously thinking about 3 years, 3 decades in corporate as well.
Right. So it's a tricky thing. I would say that a lot of it, it's the tradition. It's been this way, and people often don't realize that things
Mm,
can be a different way. I found this when I've been coaching male executives, and I've brought to them new concepts like, actually learning how to coach your team, which is not about telling them exactly what to do. It's
mhm,
about asking them questions
mm,
and helping them to come up with their own ideas and having their own ownership. So
mm,
I would say that there's this big tradition, and not knowing that there is another way, another thing
mm.
out there. So I don't see it the way this is my personal view. I don't see it as the guys being bad,
Yeah,
right? It's just the
yeah.
way that things have been. And then the question becomes, well, how do we start to do things differently? And
Mm,
um, both sides need to take responsibility.
mhm,
So the men giving more space to women to speak up, the women also kind of educating the men about what's possible, but also the women stepping up for
mm,
themselves, because it's not going
mhm.
to happen if the women are not stepping up.
Yeah.
And what I hear a lot, and I've been hearing this more and more recently talking with
Mm,
HR executives,
mhm,
is that people are agreed that we need more women in leadership in
mm,
Japan.
mhm,
The thing is that, first of all, they say they don't have the skills. Well,
mhm.
that's easy, right? We can easily do
Upskill?
training and coaching, no problem with that. But the other thing is that they don't want to be in those positions because they see it as too much stress, too demanding.
Mm,
Um, so that needs to be addressed as well, which is also going back to the question you asked me at the beginning about
mm,
why I'm so passionate about supporting women, is
mm,
because I've experienced this myself, and I've seen it so much that women really tend to get into the overwork and to
mm,
putting other people first,
mm,
and that that I think is possibly the first issue in some case, in some senses. We need to deal with that so that the women are feeling good,
mhm.
and then they're able to actually step up into those leadership positions as well.
Mhm. I'd love to hear a little bit more, as you mentioned, this idea of stepping up. Lots of your training and your focus is on presentation skills as well. And
Mm.
one thing that I find really interesting is that I too am also really passionate about helping people present and show up and step up for themselves. And I've noticed that sometimes I wrote recently, recently 2 years ago, an article on speaking in another language, and I recognized that
Mm.
everything that I said, or how to present in another language, and everything that I said is absolutely still relevant if you're speaking your own native language. But then you
Right.
kind of recognize that you're kind of giving this advice, but it's just through a different lens. Um, Tell us a little bit more about this idea of stepping up. So when someone says that they want to step up or they want to speak up, show up, some people might know it as leaning in. How does someone go about doing that when maybe it's not naturally something that they're comfortable doing?
Okay, so there's two things that I really want to get across here. First, so if we can come to that one second, but the first one is what you said about the speaking up in your non-native language, because oh my goodness, and you hear this, right, Brittany, and I hear this all the time. Oh well, I'm not confident because it's not my native language, and I'm talking from experience. You're talking from experience
Yeah.
because we've learned Japanese as our non-native language, right?
Mhm.
So everything that Japanese clients are saying to me about their concerns about speaking English, I understand that. But it's like you say, a lot of it is the same thing. It's about communication. It's not about the language. You don't need to have perfect grammar. You don't need to have the perfect accent. I mean,
Mm,
I started with a Yorkshire accent. Right? And you don't have to have like all the sophisticated words. And in fact, if
mm,
you're using really sophisticated words, it makes it
mm,
in many cases more difficult for your audience to
mm,
follow. So it's more about the communication than about the language. So I really encourage people to just, set that aside, stop making the language excuse, because you're holding yourself back if you're making the language excuse all the time.
mhm,
So I wanted to
mhm,
just get that one out there because I am guessing that a number of your listeners, this will
mhm,
be definitely relevant for them. And the other part was about how do you start to step up because you're not feeling confident. And my goodness,
Right.
this has been such a topic recently. I don't know if are you on Clubhouse? I don't know if you've
Yes.
right. Okay. So I've recently become active on Clubhouse, and I'm hosting rooms on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and I'm doing it in Japanese. Right. Now that's
Nice.
that's a step out of my comfort zone. But I what I've been hearing is that
Mm.
people want to listen to me more in Japanese. So, I'm doing it. And this has been a topic we've been talking about, this whole confidence issue. One story that I share is back in my McKinsey days when I first started there. I was surrounded by all these like really smart people, and it was a little
Mm.
bit intimidating in some ways. Right. And when I was in a meeting, I felt scared to speak up, to step up.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized that I had to if
Yeah.
I wanted to get, the recognition, and if I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be able to make the contribution in my work.
Mm-hmm.
So I started off with the small meetings, and I would, you know,
Mm-hmm.
make my statement, say something.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, wow. Because I was like doki doki, I was like really
Mm.
nervous about speaking out. But I said something and it was okay. And then that gave me that little bit of confidence to go to the next step of
Mm-hmm.
a slightly bigger meeting. And I do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And this carried on again and again and again until ultimately, this was towards the end of my career. We had a big town hall meeting, and
Mm-hmm.
my boss was there, and he had the mic,
Mm.
and he suddenly said, "I'm sure Helen will have something to say on this," and he just
Oh,
handed the
Helen
mic to me.
Sandozo.
Yeah, exactly, nothing. And at that point, I just took the mic and I started speaking, and I realized afterwards, I thought, wow, I would never have been able to do that years
Mm-hmm.
ago when I first started. But it was so going back to your kind of long way of answering your question, it's just about taking those little steps.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have confidence at the beginning. I think
No, of course not.
the idea of having confidence at the beginning is a complete myth. And this, I did
Yeah.
a podcast episode on this as well,
Mm-hmm.
that confidence comes from competence,
Mm-hmm.
right? Being
Mm-hmm.
able to do something. And the only way that you get that competence, the
Mm-hmm.
ability, is by doing it. So if
Yes.
you're saying, oh, I can't do it till I'm confident, well, you're never going to do it. So you
Mm-hmm.
just got to step out of the comfort zone.
I think that's so relevant that some people have this idea of, okay, how do I go from never really speaking English or never really speaking Japanese to running an entire workshop or running, a full day workshop or something? And that's really setting yourself up for failure, right? And so, as you mentioned, when people say, how do you do it? And people also say to me, because I, like you, had really positive feedback after I launched my first Japanese podcast episode from people saying, I really appreciate it. And actually, you putting yourself out there, and I don't mean you as in you, I mean you as in when somebody does, when you put yourself out there, people look at you and they look at your mistakes and they look at you and they say, you know what? Maybe I could do that too. Right. And so
Yeah.
we're all, and I think even if you're out there and you're speaking, you're making mistakes. And even when I'm editing my podcast episodes and they're in Japanese, I hear my own grammar mistakes and I hear my own, like, say, like my own, like things that I say in Japanese, like ridiculously. And then I think, oh gosh, how embarrassing. But the idea is how do we model or role model the kind of behavior that we also kind of want, that we also want to communicate? What some of the maybe the behaviors that you've had to role model for others that you've also wanted to develop in yourself?
Well, it's exactly what you just said. And in terms of the podcasts, right? I very, very rarely edit my podcast these days.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the early days, I did a tiny bit, but actually, no, not much at all. I mean, even in, I think, episode 2, I was talking about the whole perfectionism idea, and perfectionism holds you back.
Mm.
And that when I am speaking on my podcast, like I was speaking in my native language and I mess up. Like I was like, no, I didn't want to say that, or a word just doesn't come out right, and
Yeah.
I just let it go.
Yeah.
And I feel like, by doing that, I'm giving space to other people. I'm letting
Mm-hmm.
people see that, look, it's perfectly okay. You can have
Mm.
a podcast and you can keep going, and
Mm-hmm.
it's fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, you know there's a lot more. Um, authenticity. It's that word, right? I was just trying to think,
Mm-hmm.
what's the word? Authenticity these days.
Mm.
People, if we go back to that topic of presenting, in the old days, presentations were really sort of polished, and it
Oh
was more
yeah.
like being on stage, like being separate from the audience.
Mm.
Whereas now it's not about being separate.
Mm.
It's not about being a performance. It's about connecting with the audience. And to connect with the audience, when you can be authentic and really sort of show who you are, that's when you get the stronger connection.
Mm-hmm. And that authenticity is, you, would you say that it's things like not getting down on yourself when you make a mistake, or what are the other kind of things for you, or those kind of flags that you say, or not flags because I think that has a negative connotation. The more that I'm away from my home country, I think the less I should use idioms because it's just honestly.
Yeah.
Um, what are the other kind of examples of authenticity that someone can live? So obviously making mistakes and keep going, but is there anything else?
Yeah, so it's about the making the mistakes in the moment and keeping going, right? And just
Mm-hmm.
being, honest and open about
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, I also really encourage leaders, we're going back to the leadership topic here,
Mm-hmm.
to be open about the struggles that they've had, or um, it could even
Mm,
be what's going on for them at the time. I'm not saying that they
mm,
they have a town hall meeting and it's like, oh, I had a terrible evening last night. No, I'm not
yeah.
saying that, but first of all, when they can share their stories of things that have been
Mm,
difficult for them, that
mm-hmm,
really gives encouragement to the people coming up in the organization. But
mm,
also, what I was saying in terms of sharing a little bit more about how things are going with you, this really relates to this the women's it's not just women. It does relate very strongly to the women's topic, and something else we
mm,
might want to go
mm-hmm,
into is I in recent years I became really passionate as well about understanding women's cycles and how that impacts your work, and about actually, because you go through the month, even though we know about PMS, right? Everybody
mm-hmm,
I think knows about premenstrual syndrome, and that it's a really tough time for women, but there are actually four distinct phases. And when you understand how your mind is, how your
mm-hmm,
body is, how your hormones are, and you can then adjust the work that you're doing based
mm-hmm,
on that, or adjust your expectations of yourself. And what I was saying about
mm-hmm,
being open with other people is,
mm-hmm,
for example, in my team, within Team Sasuga, we have a small and mighty team, small and mighty global team. We're actually all working women, working mothers, and we share with each other which phase of the
mm-hmm,
cycle we are in, so that we can have more understanding of each other. If we know, like, oh, so she's in this phase now, so she probably doesn't need to be disturbed so much, or she's in this phase, so let's have more speaking opportunities now, or
mm,
um, and that makes a difference, because otherwise, if somebody's suddenly, in a bad mood, or they seem to be in a bad mood, or they're acting in a certain way, we can make assumptions about why they're doing that
mm-hmm,
that are not necessarily the case.
mm-hmm,
And it could even be, something personal going on in their life, like, maybe they've had some bad news, maybe their family member's sick or whatever.
mm-hmm,
So I'm all for being not, you don't need to announce it to everybody, but the
mm-hmm.
people that you're working with closely, so that they can understand what's going on with you. And then you can have a bit more flexibility for each other.
Yeah, I think that's so relevant. And I'd love if we can now maybe dig a little deeper here, especially if we think about the current kind of climate that we're in, being that people are working from home, and we're not
Yeah.
looking at kind of like 2 or 3 months. We're now, we're clicking on over to a year now, when everyone thought we'd be back in the office in 3 weeks. We're clicking on over to a year now. So I'd love just for you to really just go on a talking spree on definitely talk a little bit more about those those elements that really help people go from just well to excel. And I always write in my email, stay well. And when I spoke to you, you said it's not just about being well, it's about excelling from well to excel. And I thought, oh wow, that really kind of stayed with me. um,
Mm.
because staying well is really important. But I also think, in terms of what you meant, even thinking in phases, that staying well maybe is a phase, and there is kind of an opportunity that we then maybe want to also reach a little bit. Like how long, for example, even during this COVID time, do we just have to just survive? Is there an opportunity that we can maybe excel in this period? I'd love to hear about that. And then also maybe through the lens of, you're also well known for talking about the difference kind of between gaman and knowing kind of when to stop, right? So if we think a little bit about how that all kind of, plays into one, very, kind of juggling act, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so that was a lot of questions. So I don't know
Yeah,
if I'll be able
sorry.
to remember all of it. You may need no. You may need to prompt me as we go. But let's start with the part of being, so the well and excel.
Mm-hmm.
The part of being well, that's the first hurdle, because
Mm-hmm.
many people are not well.
Yeah.
They are neglecting their self-care. And I'm also talking from experience, because I did it for many, many years. And even now I'm much better at it. It's still, I still have to be conscious about making time for my self-care and making sure I am looking after myself, because if I'm not at my best, if I'm not physically at my best and mentally at my best,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm not able to excel. So
Mm-hmm.
the first thing is, we've got to get people from really, struggling and neglecting their self-care to looking after themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's also from there, how do you excel? So
Mm-hmm.
um, and then the excel is just like, okay, what are the specific skills that you need in your work, in your business? Sasuga success cycle. Self-care is first. That's phase one.
Mm-hmm.
Phase two is create your plan. It's all about goal setting and your vision, your goal setting, your planning, all those things. Phase three is all around communication. So it's presenting, it's facilitating meetings, it's influence and persuasion, all of those things. And then phase four is complete your tasks, which is all about productivity. How do you
Yeah,
get things
getting it
done
done.
in the way that works for you? So this is something we were talking about a little bit earlier. I think before we started this podcast episode, is that there are, you have individual preferences. So I'm a huge believer in doing what works for you. A lot of coaches go out there and say, this is the approach, this is how you do it, but it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. So take the take the coaching, take the advice, and how does it make sure it's working for you? And if you are working with a coach, make sure you're having a dialogue with that coach to be sure it actually does work for you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important. And if we even talk about making it work for you, I think it really does come down to understanding how you work. And I think for women, there is this element, there is this biological element, obviously being your cycle that you mentioned, but also men, this is relevant to women in your life or women in your team or whoever it may be, but it's also even relevant to you. I'm sure that if you're a man listening to this, you might not have a biological cycle like a woman does, but I'm sure that there's times that you might need to recognize your own triggers and understand when you're high energy or low energy. And I think for many people,
can I jump in, because I
yes,
really
of
want to
course.
jump in with that, because men have the same they have the cycle, but it's, for men it's a 24-hour cycle. So it's
Oh,
basically because of your hormones.
well, tell us
So
more about this, because I haven't heard about this.
okay, so, and this is not something that I've studied in great detail, just giving you the general overview. Is, it's the testosterone is the big the
Mm,
big hormone, and that's the one that's higher in men in the morning. So for most men, they're going to have a lot more energy in the morning. They want to get things done in the morning, and then that gradually the testosterone levels decrease
mm-hmm,
throughout the day, so they're going to have less energy in the evening.
mm-hmm,
So that's just a very, very simple view of it. With women, we get into more energy as we're going into ovulation.
mm,
So that's the time that, this I found so fascinating when I first started to research this, is that the time of around ovulation is when you are naturally more attractive.
Oh,
to
interesting.
people around you, right? That's when you kind of like your skin's going to be looking better, and you just have a lot more positive outlook on life,
Spring in your
because that's
step kind of thing.
yeah, you're right. And that is the ideal time then to
Mhm.
be communicating. So that's why we talk about
Mm.
in the Sasuga success cycle phase 3, that's the when you're actually physically in that phase, if you possibly can, if you've got a big presentation, if you have any influence and you can time it at that, for that phase, then you are working with, your natural cycle, your body, and making it easier for you.
Mhm.
Plus, going to the point of excelling, once you know the skills of how to present in an effective way, then life's so much easier and you
Right.
do a better job.
Right. And so probably also maybe during, the stage 4 of your cycle is probably when you should avoid, for example, running a remote design sprint, for example, like what I remember this is when I first heard about this theory of yours, it was exactly the time where I looked at my calendar and I thought, well,
Yeah,
I
that wasn't a good
couldn't.
idea.
Yeah, the calendar literally read backwards of how it should have perhaps read. And I know that lots of people maybe are in either corporate jobs or that they don't work for themselves and that they don't have as much say. But
Yeah,
let's maybe even dive into a little bit, Helen, about maybe what people can do just at these micro moments for
yeah.
themselves rather than, for example, planning an entire week because maybe people are rolling their eyes at us saying, yeah, forget it. What are
Yeah,
some, maybe
I
some of
don't have
them?
that control. Yeah.
Yeah. What are some maybe like micro moments that people could build into their life that would help them go from well to excel?
All right, so I'm going to answer that, and I also want to go back to where you said this. I think you said this concept of yours. So actually, I learned about this, the idea or the concept of working with the cycles
Mm-hmm.
from two books. So one was called The Optimized Woman, and
Mm-hmm.
one is Do Less.
Mm-hmm.
And they both kind of came into my life around the same time, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, these are talking about the same sort of
Interesting.
concept.
Yeah.
And then as I say, do what works for you. So I looked at that concept, and then I thought about how does this really work in a professional situation, and how can we make it really, easy to understand. So that's how I then developed the Sasuga success cycle from there. So then go back to your question about, okay, I can't plan to have all my presentations in phase 3. And what if my cycle's irregular, right?
Yes,
I thought it
exactly.
was going to be this week and it's delayed or whatever, right? So you can't that's the ideal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when I have weeks like that, I'm like, yay, it's so great.
Yes.
It's all synced up nicely. But often it doesn't happen. And this is what is really, really key. And in a sense, I would say this is perhaps the most powerful part of the success cycle
Mm-hmm.
is being kind to yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you are in, as you said, the example of phase 4, and you've got a big project going on, and phase 4, yes, you do. So that phase 4, by the way, is the week before your period.
Mm-hmm.
Um, During that time, you often will want to be more sort of internally focused. You maybe don't have patience to talk to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And once you can recognize that you can use the kind of the intense energy
Mm-hmm.
of that phase
Mm-hmm.
in a very focused way, you can kind of build on that strength. And then if you notice that you are finding it difficult to communicate with people during that time, just be kind to yourself and just say, that's okay. I'm not at
Mm-hmm.
my best now, and it's fine because I'm going into another cycle, and then I'll do what I can to adjust next time.
Mm-hmm.
So just being kind to yourself and lowering your expectations of yourself when you're in those sort of lower energy times.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so interesting when we think about I'm not at my best, for example. I'd almost, almost when you said that, it kind of made me the thing that kind of popped into my mind was in those moments that is my best. You know what I mean? And so it's like that is my best. And so it does come down to that idea of being kind to yourself and recognizing this is what I can do today. In another
Mm-hmm.
moment, in another time, I'm sure I'd be able to deliver something different. But right now,
Yeah.
with these circumstances is where I am. And I'm sure many people even feel that now, being, a year working from home,
Yeah.
living in a state of emergency and wondering, gee, I wonder why I'm not as productive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you've just got it's a different environment,
Mhm.
and it's about doing your best in the environment that you have, and not just doing your best in the environment that you have, because a lot of people do that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's accepting that that is good enough,
Mm-hmm.
because so
Absolutely.
many people, so many, I'm going to say women here, just in my experience from coaching, is I do find that the women give themselves a hard time saying, I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough. And like, my goodness, if you actually sat down and looked at everything that you've done today, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we forget very, very easily what we've done.
Mm-hmm. If
Achievement
we
amnesia.
Yeah, if we think about, that, and obviously, being in Japan, it also kind of be that kind of the idea of high performance. They're not necessarily high performing because of a whole lot of reasons, attached to culture and things like that. But if we think about the idea behind, trying hard, gaman, and if we think about that role and you communicating, for example, with executives that we are the kinds of environment that you kind of want to create for a high performing team. Have you noticed either a change in the way in which executives have been thinking over the last sort of like years when you first began your work, or and also have you noticed any perhaps change within your other clients as well in terms of that that idea of authenticity, balancing gaman, that idea of managing perfectionism? Have you noticed any mindset shifts over the years?
I have seen a slight reduction in
Mm-hmm.
the crazy work um, mindset that I was experiencing in my very early days, in Japan in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the same time, I think there's still a long way to go, because the expectations are still very, very high. And going back to this part about high performance, the expectation tends to be that you're going to be performing at that same high level every day.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I'm just saying, is that it's natural for you to have fluctuations, and that's okay, and to be um, focusing more on the activities that are more suited for that particular time, as far as you can in your schedule, right? and then
Mm-hmm.
and then being kind to yourself with the other parts. Going to gaman, that that putting up with the situation. I find this is a fascinating concept, and in some ways, gaman, it's a I'm just trying to think of what's the right way to say this in English. As you were saying
It's just
earlier,
sucking it
sometimes
up.
we struggle even in our
In Australia, we would say
language.
suck it up. That's what you would say in Australia.
Yes, it is suck it up in some sense, because the thing is, gammon can be interpreted in different ways, right? It can be
Mm-hmm.
suck it up, like gammon shinasai,
Yeah.
right? Um, but virtuous, that's the word I was, it
Ah,
wasn't coming to me. It's like
yes.
it's a very virtuous word in some sense,
Yeah.
because I
Yokogamba.
totally agree with this concept of gammon, like when something has, like a natural disaster, for example. When there's a
Mm.
disaster, you just have to, put up
その時
with
に
it. You
我慢す
can't,
る. Yeah.
right? You, you
Yeah.
you can't change that. You just have to do your best in that situation. So that sort of gammon, I think, is wonderful. I love
Mm.
that concept. What I what concerns me is gammon when people are putting up with a situation. Um, it could be a work situation, and it's stressing them,
Mhm.
because it's actually a situation that they could do something about.
Mhm.
So if it's, for example, in a work situation, if you have
Mhm.
some colleagues that you're, or a colleague who you're not getting on with, then there are things that you can do
Mhm.
about that. Like, you could, approach that colleague directly,
Mhm.
potentially, or talk with someone else, or look at, is there a possibility so that you're not having to work with that colleague,
Mhm.
or a little bit of a mindset shift of like, do you really need to be focusing so much of your attention on that colleague in the first place? How much
Mm.
of your own time and energy are you wasting by
Mm.
focusing on that person? Or if it's really bad, you have a choice to leave the company. And a
Mhm.
lot of people don't realize that, and they just get into the gammon rather than looking at, okay, what are ways to get out of the gammon.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. There's many things about Japanese culture, especially being coming from a foreign perspective, that are bamboozling and puzzling. You think, why is that? But there's also some really great things, especially when and also even these kind of two-sided coins. You have, for example, one side government having great things, but then also having challenges. If we think about when I have listened to your podcast and I listen to your messages, I can't help but think that it's not only about communication. It's not only about this kind of bicultural, communication expert, but it's really about being your best self. That it's really just a journey of helping people just unpack a little bit what's going on with them, so that they can really live their lives in a way that works for them. And if we think, obviously now there's significant challenges and people are feeling maybe the pressure of outside forces making decisions. And for example, it's everything from that can really affect you. Even for example, in Japan, like the travel ban, for example, that existed for a long time. For example, I'm permanent residents, even if they were foreign, but they weren't Japanese, so they weren't allowed to travel. For example,
Yeah.
and if we think a little bit about living your best self living your best
Hmm.
self in an environment that you obviously have to navigate. Maybe that's a work environment, maybe that's even living abroad. Can you talk to us a little bit more about maybe some things that we haven't covered that encompass that living your best life? So obviously one being communication, but what are some other things that come to your mind when you think of that living your best life?
Well, I think we've touched on it already. When you are in a very challenging situation and you have these kind of restrictions going on in your life that are out of your control, it is a complete waste of your time and energy to focus on that. Right,
Mm,
because you can't do anything about it.
mhm,
So any time that you're going, oh, it's not, it's not fair, I have to stay, I can't go and visit my family, or blah, 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 there's no point.
mm,
Right, so I would say, think about where you are focusing your attention,
mhm,
and instead of focusing on your attention on what cannot change,
mhm,
focus your attention on, okay, what can you do? Because my
mhm.
goodness, there are so many opportunities that have come out of this, this situation that we've been experiencing in the last year or so.
Mhm. Is there anything that you do specifically that kind of, if you're having kind of a down moment, like do you go for a walk? Are you one of those bread baking people? What is what's some what's what's your strategies?
I do find journaling very, very helpful,
Mm,
and
mhm,
I also I will take myself through a little process of,
mhm,
asking myself, what is what is going on with you, Helen? Why are you so upset about something, right? Or why are you feeling down, or whatever?
mhm,
And I will ask myself that, write it down,
mhm,
and then the next question is, can I do anything about that?
mhm,
Right? Identifying what the factors are. And then there may be some things that I can't make a change to, like we just
mhm,
talked about. So then I know to move my attention away from that. Okay, so what can I do differently?
mhm,
And I'll usually write down maybe at least three things. What are three things that I can do immediately from now that I'm going to feel better about? Go do those three things one after another, and then I'm out of it. So
mhm,
you know, in the old days, um, I I would often get into a lot of negativity,
mm,
even though a lot of people see me as a very, very happy person, and that's all about, in the old days, was all about the people pleasing side of things.
mm,
Didn't want to show that I was upset with stuff, but I would have that a lot more internal anguish,
mm, mhm,
right? And that could last for a long time, which is
mhm,
really, really unhealthy. Um, Whereas now, I'm a normal human being, so I do have
mhm,
my ups and downs. The downs are not so often.
mhm,
And when I do have the downs, I can get out of them very, very quickly. So,
mhm,
and I give again, being kind to myself, I'm like, oh, yeah, I wasn't actually fully at my best then.
mhm.
And if it's been something that's involved another person, then I'll go and talk with that person about it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's, I can certainly relate to that as well. Because I would say if I'm like a negative person or a positive person, I would certainly say that I'm on the positive side. But then I think if you zoom out a bit, it's not necessarily about being positive or negative. I think it's just that you maybe connect deeply with emotions. And sometimes if you have the same way that you feel really happy, you can also kind of have the reverse emotion to that, which is either feeling disappointed or feeling frustrated or whatever that is. And it's like, everything that we've
Yeah.
talked about, it's this idea of like being able to recognize the journey and then be able to preempt, okay, what's my next step and how can I respond?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Because um, I've done some of the podcast episodes talking about, more about that positive, what
Mm.
can you do, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
But I'm definitely not saying to dismiss the um, those sort of tough feelings that,
Hmm.
when you're going through a hard time, absolutely recognize it and feel it. And my goodness, I cry very, very easily.
Mm.
And to get into that emotion of, having a cry and then, okay, that feels so much better now. And
Hmm.
then, okay, now I can move on. So it's like really feel the feeling,
Hmm.
and then move on from it.
It sounds like, to me, this idea of helping people move from well to excel, to really be able to live that kind of the life that they're designing. If we think about what that requires, right? And if I think this is perhaps even where the communication comes in, because living that best life requires a communication to yourself. What are some
Hmm.
things that you would require or that you would recommend, people, that when they are communicating with themselves, or they are building that communication, that internal dialogue, what are some things you think that people should keep in mind? What makes for a good internal communication?
So I love this. I would say, would you say that to your best friend?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so okay, so let's go here. Let's go here. The concept of loving yourself,
Uh-huh.
right? So this might be something that people coming to a business podcast might think, "What is she talking about?"
Oh,
And
this
it's
is this is
perhaps
the core of business. Yeah, yeah. Core of business is
right.
people. Yeah, yeah, I'm with
It
you on this.
actually, it actually is, right? And it was a long time before I started to recognize the significance of this. And the more I've
Hmm.
been talking about it in especially in my, my online groups, um, I realize the significance of it. And when I start talking about it, the women really sort of open up to it and embrace this whole
Hmm.
idea and start to actually work on how to love themselves more,
Hmm.
because we've been brought up with so many expectations, societal expectations
Hmm.
of how you should be as a little girl, um, and really taken that on, and that sense of I'm not good enough and I've got to please other people. So then you're not coming from a place of loving yourself as a child,
Hmm.
right? And that then goes into adulthood. And so what I very strongly recommend is to start to look at that, how what is your relationship with yourself like? And as you
Hmm.
said, how are you communicating with yourself? Because if you don't have that good, solid, loving relationship with yourself, then how can you go out and have um, a good relationship with other people?
Hmm. And this even, obviously flows into obviously your personal life, but certainly your professional life. If you're thinking about, wanting to move up in the organization, moving up in an organization, particularly in a Japanese organization, requires that you have a certain level of sensibility when it comes to managing relationships, and understanding, and patience, and things like that. So certainly having this first step, and when it does come to business, and often people say business is business, but I think, you and I know that in Japan, and we've both worked, and particularly, yourself, Helen, have a lot of experience in terms of working with, very large, very strong economic powerhouses, and at the end of the day, they're still very much run by people. And so the better that we can kind of learn to manage ourselves, in then we can also understand, oh, okay, maybe this particular task is not a task that is in line with my strengths. Let me
Mm-hmm.
let me get someone in to help me with this, or maybe I can give an opportunity to someone younger in the team that might be really good at this, and that can be an opportunity for them to shine. So I think this idea of hiding or playing to your strengths, or not, not hiding your weaknesses, is really an opportunity for also for you to be a leader.
Mm-hmm.
In design thinking, people often ask, I want to facilitate, right? So they're a participant, and then within 10 minutes, they're like, Brittany, I want to learn to facilitate. When can I learn to facilitate? And often we say, well, if you want to be a facilitator, first be a really great participant.
Yeah.
First learn how you can lead yourself, and then learn how you might be able to help the person next to you or remotely next to you and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
How would you what's your view on beginning with yourself and then growing into something else?
Totally. The advice that you just gave there, I would say, is spot on. Because, and then this is the thing as well. It kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier on about having some sort of goal and not having the confidence to get there. It's because you have that big end goal, and that's a long way away. So taking the small steps to get there, I would say, is most effective. Like you said, be a great participant first. Makes so much more sense to me.
One thing that I'd love to also hear a little bit about on, so we're not only we have a lot in common, but we also have the fact that we both have podcasts. So tell me a little bit about this whole like podcast world thing. I'm still getting my head around it. um, Tell me a little bit about your motivation behind the Sasuga podcast, and I'm going to ask you a horrible question, but some of the aha moments, because you've had some really incredible people on your podcast come and share some incredible stories. But over that, I think you just uploaded your 110th episode, I think, right?
Yeah,
A bit.
this next week is 111. Yeah.
Yeah, so a very big round of applause to you. Tell me a little bit about the motivation behind starting the Sasuga podcast, and then tell me a little bit about a few of the aha moments.
It's so funny because again in Clubhouse last night, we had this conversation about motivation and what has motivated me personally
Mhm.
at different stages of my career. And I hadn't thought about it that much, but when I realized, well, when I did think about it, I realized that a lot of my motivation sort of comes from suggestions from other people.
Mm.
And when someone says, "Oh, you could do this," and I'm like, "Yeah, okay," and then I'll I'll do the thing, and then realize that I actually really like it, and then I'll continue with the thing. Because we were talking about this about where you find your passion from as well. And it's the same sort of thing. Like I said earlier, with how to get into the women's
Mhm.
success, it was because um, one of the women who was taking communication skills coaching, she asked for something different. I'm like, oh yeah, I could do that. So I just sort
Mhm.
of, it's not some kind of big internal motivation for me. It's more like, oh, there's a little bit of outside inspiration. I'll give it a go.
Mhm.
And then I find what I like, because I realized that I loved doing podcasts. Also, I did realize that when I was little, so I'm an only child, and I did recall that when I was
Are
little, I
you?
got this.
You're very nice to be an only child.
Oh, that's like
You're you're
our
you're
only
quite
children don't sometimes.
agreeable for an only child.
That's so funny. It's because I have a people pleaser background, so
Yeah,
that's.
I'm sorry, I'm the oldest of
Um,
four.
the the when I was little, my uncle bought
Mm.
me or it wasn't, he didn't buy it me. He gave me, because he didn't want it anymore, a cassette recorder. This is way back in
Oh
the 70s,
yeah.
right? Because it was massive,
Mm.
right? I mean, if you look at an iPhone today, that was the size of one of the keys on the cassette
Oh yeah.
recorder. It was so huge. But I do recall that I would sit on my own in my room,
Mm.
and I had my own audio show going. This is even obviously way before the days of podcasts, but I was doing a kind of like a radio show, and talking and interviewing people. And when I think back, I was like, oh yeah, I did that.
Yeah, it was there.
So
The seeds were planted.
yeah, so I don't know. It was just a sort of thing that it was actually in my mastermind that they were
Hmm.
suggesting, start doing a podcast. I'm like, oh, give it a
And
go.
before we jump into your aha moments, I'd love to just double tap on this point, which is I I also in my life haven't woken up one day and thought, oh, I'm so passionate about that. That's my passion. You know what I mean? Like that also hasn't happened to me. What happens is that somebody suggests something. Helen, I went to Germany for 8 years on a suggestion of from somebody else. So I went on
Wow.
a I went to study, and because a Rotarian that I knew said, you should go to Germany and learn another language. And I thought, oh yeah, that's not a bad idea. And I went for 8 years on someone's suggestion. So in terms of taking a suggestion and going with it, I've certainly had that as well. And I think what's really interesting here is you won't get this knock on the door and saying, hello, I'm here, I'm your passion. What happens
Yeah.
is that you do something, and then if you like it a little bit, you'll do it again, and then you'll
Yeah.
do it again, and it's this feedback loop. And that's what ends up getting the consistency. It's not passion that
Yeah.
drives consistency. It's
Yeah.
that, because at 110 episodes, I'm only at half that. So I know that's a lot of work, you know. And so that's where you kind of see that passion is more that feedback loop, or the
Mm,
consistency comes from the feedback loop rather than the passion. So I thought that was
mm.
super interesting. And now, yes, I'd love to hear about your just some of the moments over 110 episodes that you thought, oh wow.
Um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Like, oh wow moments.
Or
One thing I
even
would say that I've learned is just to go with it, because
mhm.
um, conversations go in all sorts of directions, and then these little gems come up, and
Yes.
sometimes I might be thinking, oh, probably this is not enough, you know. I still get
Mm,
into that. It's not good enough, it's not valuable
mm,
enough, and then I'll put the episode out, and then I'll get a message saying that was brilliant, I really like this part. I'm like, oh
mm,
great. So as well, now I'm also thinking what's like an aha for me is when I receive those messages from
mm,
people. And there was a lady who'd contacted me a little while ago asking something, and I responded, and then I didn't
mm,
hear from her.
mm,
And then she contacted me a little while later, and she's
mm.
like, oh, I'm sorry that I didn't contact you sooner, but I feel like we're talking every day because I'm always listening to your podcast. So it's so funny as well how people, it's like relationship building,
Mm,
except I don't know who I'm building these relationships with, and people kind of feel sort of close to me,
mm.
which I think is lovely. And then I love it when I have an opportunity to actually communicate with the person, when they do contact me, or if I can actually um, have a real time conversation with someone.
Hmm. I think that that's so interesting. I've had a similar um, experience. I actually had someone who I remember the first time that someone shared something about the Business Karaoke podcast that I had never met, that I didn't know this person. Someone shared it. For me, I felt like
Mm,
this is what an artist must feel like when they hear their song like on the radio, like back in the day when people still have radio. That's what it must sound like. Um, and so there's that. And if we think about these moments of these conversations, that they can really go anywhere. And like as you mentioned, for me, and I'd love your view on this, is that the more that you kind of dig and the more like the diverse kinds of people that you talk with, for me,
mm,
the thread is that everyone's kind of got their own journey, everyone's got their own story, everyone's got their own kind of their triumphs and tribulations, and
mm,
you don't know where that person is in that time. Like I've had some people that I've, of course, well, everyone that's come on the Business Karaoke podcast I've invited, because I've thought that their story so just interesting or exciting, or there's something to learn from. And then you listen to the story and you're like, oh, it wasn't from the outside, you wouldn't have seen how um, just how kind of messy it was for them, right?
yeah.
And that I found very interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, that to me. Yes, it comes up in the podcast, it just especially comes up in coaching, is that
Mm,
I coach really senior, very very senior people, and when we get into that coaching conversation, they really open up, and
mm,
they show the sides of themselves that they're not really showing in the business.
Mhm.
And so what I've realized is that pretty much everybody's insecure.
But haven't you noticed that that side that they show you is usually their better side? Have you
Yeah,
noticed that the side that people hide, they're like, oh, I'd never
yeah.
want anyone to see me like this. I'm like, I like you 25% more now than
Yeah.
I
Well,
did.
going back to what I was saying earlier about why I really encourage the authenticity and the sharing these kind of, the challenges that you've had, because it creates a closer connection. It's strange that um, people put on the outside face thinking that that's going to be better for things, but actually it has the opposite effect.
Mhm. That's so true. If we think about the conversation that we've had, moving from well to excel, um, is there anything that we haven't covered about well to excel that you think you'd like the Business Karaoke podcast listeners to know?
Okay, so what just jumped into my mind immediately was it takes time.
Oh,
So
tell us
many,
more, Helen.
right?
Tell us more, Helen.
Well, so many people expect like transformation immediately. I mean, it's like, I'm sure you know this from doing like corporate workshops and things like that, that if people will sometimes, companies will sometimes ask for like one presentation skills training
Hmm.
session,
Hmm.
um, 2 hours um, for 50
Should be,
people.
yeah.
And I'm like, you're not going to get a lot of impact for 2 hours for 50 people. um, more and more, I have the conversations, especially with the clients that come back again and again about, if you really want the transformation and your return on investment, to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's gonna take time, and so you have to be willing to be okay with that time, and to be patient, and to just to allow it time to happen.
Hmm. Yes, I couldn't agree more. Things do take time. If I think about, the innovation workshops that we run, usually we get like a knock on the door because they're 10 years behind where they already want to be. So we ideally would have got the call 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And then we get the call today. And then they said, we've had this problem for about 30 years. Um, So we heard about these Google 5-day sprints. Do you think that that'll be that'll be enough? And you think, oh boy, yes. So certainly time
Yeah.
is is something, and this is why nobody's asking for my opinion, but I'll give it to them anyway. Which is that choosing something that you don't mind that it takes longer than expected for me has been the thing, especially when it comes to doing business in Japan. If you're not passionate about the people, the culture, or what you're doing, it's simply you can't hold on for the time required in order to see those
Mm,
seeds that you've planted to see them blossom. For me, it's finding that thing
mm,
that you're happy to wait.
mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, have the patience, and that's hard for a lot of high performers, me
Yeah.
included.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's why you have to do things in the meantime, keep yourself busy while everything else is growing. So, Helen, on that note, thank you so much. I really appreciate your honesty, your stories, the work that you're doing, especially when it comes to helping women in particularly understand their themselves, their bodies, their cycles, their lives, in order for them to then go ahead and live that life of their dreams, and then also what that what also men can take away, the idea of being authentic and being vulnerable, and there's no need to hide, there's no faces that you need to put up. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the stories that you shared today.
Thank you so much. And so I'd just like to say to your listeners, uh, really the decision is yours. Like, if you want to start going from where you are now to well and then to excel, it's your decision, because the resources, the support is all out there. There's never been a time for it to be easier. So if I can help you, feel free to contact me and tell me, what's the area that you want to work in, and I can let you know what's the easiest resource to go to.
Yes, and I will add all of Helen's details in our show notes. So she's only one click away.
Yay.
So, on that note, Helen, thank you so much. Come back to the Business Karaoke podcast whenever you like.
Oh, just ask me. I'm sure we can we can find plenty to talk about.